Okay, so welcome to our second installment of the Odyssey videos. Last video, I tried to just give you a basic sort of introduction, orientation to the Odyssey. I have a very particular aim in this video, and that is to give you help give you a greater appreciation for the artistry of the Odyssey. Hopefully you find the Odyssey to be a fun read. It's a great story. It's an exciting story. But there's more to the Odyssey than just the story itself. And I don't want to focus, and I don't want you to focus simply on the content of the story. But I want you to pay close attention to how Homer tells the story. In the previous video, I talked a little bit about classics, and I think one thing I could add to that is that any book, certainly any work of fiction that is considered to be a classic, is not a classic simply because it has a good story to tell, but it's a classic because it also tells the story ingeniously, artfully, craftily, we might even say. So when we're looking at any work of literature, there's two things to keep in mind. There's first of all the content, and the content is what most of us pay attention to most of the time. When I say content, we're talking about certainly the plot, characters and character development, major themes, and things of that nature. But there's also the form. Right? Every author has to make artistic choices about what form to use to deliver that content. So the form is how a story is told. The structure of the plot, the pacing of the story, the kind of language that's used, the writing style, we might say. And so that's form, and what makes a masterpiece, what makes a classic, is a book in which not only is the content rich, but the form is also very effective. And not only that, but in a great work of literature like the Odyssey, form and content work together. They reinforce each other. And hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a better idea of what I mean by that, because I'm going to give you an example of that from the Odyssey, where we see how the form shapes the content and the content shapes the form. So, as I said, today's focus is going to be Homer's storytelling techniques, his narrative techniques, and why they matter. Okay? Because again, not only are these storytelling techniques going to make the story more engaging, but they're also going to draw our attention to some of the themes that Homer wants us to pay attention to. So and I could do a lot more, but I'm going to focus on 3 examples of Homer's storytelling prowess. 3 choices that Homer makes when telling the story. Because certainly Homer could have told this story very, very differently. First, technique. And you'll hear about this if you haven't listened already to Dr. Edmondson's lecture. You'll hear him say a little bit more about this, or he'll mention this at least. But the story is not told in a straightforward, linear fashion. If it was told in a straightforward, linear fashion, the story would begin with Odysseus in Troy. The war is over, the Greeks have won, but now he's got to find his way back home, and then we would sort of follow him on his way back home to Ithaca. Story doesn't really begin that way at all, right? Once the story starts, he's already been wandering around for years after leaving Troy, and we're right in the middle of things. This is a convention, a storytelling convention that you can find in a number of epics. and it's known as in medias res. In medias res. I-N space M-E-D-I-A-S space R-E-S. That's a Latin term, literally means in the middle of the thing. So the Odyssey begins in the middle of the story. Ancient Greeks, later the Romans, they're going to love this device. Why? Why tell a story this way? I think there are a number of advantages. Just from the standpoint of engaging the reader, starting in medias res creates a kind of sense of excitement. So there's no long, boring exposition at the beginning. Oh, here's Odysseus. Here's a little bit about his background. Here's why he's where he is now. Here's what he's going to do next. No, you are plunged right into the story. And there's a kind of excitement in trying to piece together what's happening. And I think if you are a movie lover, you know that there are several movies that deploy that very technique quite well. Christopher Nolan is good about this. Inception or Batman Begins. The story kind of begins in the middle. You're trying to figure out what's happening, but that's part of the fun. So I think that's one reason to use it. Another reason to use it is simply because Homer doesn't need to tell the story in a linear fashion, because his readers were already basically familiar with the story. They certainly knew stories about the Trojan War. They at least knew some versions of stories about Odysseus. And so he doesn't have to kind of explain who Odysseus was or where he came from or how he got to be in Troy or any of that. He can just start right in with the story. So that's one technique that Homer uses. Another aspect of the Odyssey's form I want to draw attention to is its structure. There are 24 books of the Odyssey, and once you've moved through it, you can see that there are 4 basic units. Okay? There's books 1 through 4, which describe Telemachus's travels. There's books 5 through 8, which are all about how Odysseus gets from Calypso's island to the land of the Phaeacians, Scheria being the name of that island. Then books 9 through 12 are all about Odysseus's time in Scheria, and the bulk of those books is taken up with a story he tells that basically functions as a flashback, right? So the Scherians ask, or the Phaeacians ask him, "Who are you? How did you get here?" And he starts telling the story from the beginning. So that's books 1 through 12. Then books 13 through 14 are all about Odysseus back in Ithaca, trying to find a way to undo the suitors and restore himself, or to reestablish himself as the rightful king of Ithaca, as the rightful husband of Penelope, and so on. So step back for a moment and notice the balance. Exactly half of the book, books 1 through 12, are all about how Odysseus gets to Ithaca, or gets back to Ithaca. And then the second half all takes place in Ithaca as he prepares to get his revenge. So there's that nice balance there, that even if you're not paying close attention to it as you read it, I think makes the book that much more satisfying. And that brings me to the third aspect of the Odyssey's form that I want to highlight. I'm going to spend the most time on this, because this is going to be an example, again, of how form and content are going to reinforce each other in the Odyssey. One could describe Homer's storytelling style in the Odyssey as tricky, devious, cunning even. And I've already alluded to why that would be, right? He doesn't start the story at the beginning. He starts in the middle, in medias res. Then later on, there are flashbacks. Then you go back forward in time. It's not a linear kind of story. And I think that trickiness, and I'll say more about that, is not just Homer having fun, although maybe that's part of it. But I think it also nicely reflects or represents the main character of the Odyssey, Odysseus himself. Now, Odysseus, of course, has several traits that define him, but if there's one trait, one characteristic of Odysseus that is truly definitive, it is his cunning, his craftiness, his wit. And so Homer is going to tell the story of Odysseus in a way that honors the character of Odysseus himself. So for one thing, as you read, pay attention to places where Odysseus's wit, his duplicity, his cunning really comes out. I mean, there's a number of places where Odysseus proves himself to be quite a fluent liar. I mean, this is a guy who at the drop of a hat can not only lie, but who can come up with an intricate, convoluted, complicated lie that is nonetheless totally believable. Okay? So this is somebody who is not afraid to use deception, to tell you one thing, but to mean something else. He's also a master of disguise. And we see this at several places. We're told that before the great sort of emptying of the Trojan horse at the end of the Trojan War, he disguised himself as a beggar and actually entered the city walls of Troy to sort of scope things out and case the joint, so to speak. And then, of course, there's the fact that for many books in the second half of the Odyssey, he is disguised, thanks in part to Athena, as a kind of old, pathetic beggar. So he's a master of disguise. And I just want to point out that what we see here in the Odyssey is a very different kind of hero than the main hero of the Iliad, which is Achilles. Achilles is a great warrior. He is almost superhumanly strong and tough. But he's really all brawn in some ways. He's not known for his wit, his cleverness, his intelligence. He's famous for his battle prowess. And in the Iliad, Homer's storytelling style reflects that. It's not tricky. He's not sort of moving back and forth in time. Rather, the storytelling is much more linear, one foot after the other kind of storytelling. So in both epics, both the Iliad and the Odyssey, the way the story is told reflects the central hero. So let me give you one specific example of the trickiness, or I guess I should say another example of the wiliness, the craftiness of Homer as storyteller. If you're reading the Odyssey for the first time, one of the things that perhaps has already surprised you or should surprise you is the fact that the story, it's called the Odyssey, which is basically the song of Odysseus. So we know right from the start that this story is all about Odysseus, or at least that's what we're led to believe. But then it turns out that we don't actually sort of catch up with Odysseus until book 5. Right? There's the first 4 books are really mainly about Telemachus and his situation. So already Homer has kind of pulled a fast one on us and made us wait to meet Odysseus. which we finally do at the beginning of Book 5. And really, even there's another kind of example of this just on the first page of the Odyssey, where in the initial sort of stanzas, we're told about a hero. Okay, where the poet says something about a hero, a cunning hero. But then we don't actually get Odysseus's name until line 15, right? So there's that same pattern of creating anticipation and then making the reader wait for the gratification. Right? So we see that at the very beginning of Book 1, and we see that in Books 1 through 5 in general. Just kind of a fun little Greek thing. It's worth noting that the name Calypso is related to the Greek word to hide. And of course, when we first meet Odysseus, he is hidden from the rest of the world on Calypso's island. But he's not just hidden from the rest of the world. For the first 4 books of the Odyssey, he's hidden from the reader. We hear people talking about him. We know he's this great hero, but he's hidden from our eyes until Book 5. So we see the same kind of craftiness in Homer's storytelling here that we see in Odysseus's own actions as the story unfolds. Now, there are other reasons for this sort of misdirection or this delay. Delays create suspense. Okay, so the longer we have to wait to actually meet Odysseus, the more we hear other people talking about Odysseus, the keener our anticipation becomes to actually sort of catch up and join up with Odysseus. And again, we could point to many examples in film. My personal favorite example being the movie Jaws, where you don't actually see the shark until the movie's like 2/3 of the way over. And by that point, you're absolutely on pins and needles waiting to see this shark. Okay, similar kind of thing. But I do think above all, Homer selected this technique because, again, he could have told the story in a very different way. But he chose this technique because of how well it matches Odysseus's own character. Time and again in the Odyssey, we see that Odysseus is wily and he's wary. He doesn't want to reveal himself too soon, right? He wants to disguise himself until the time is really ripe to reveal who he is. We see this in a couple of places. We see this when he's on the island of the Phaeacians. In Book 7, Queen Arete asked him, who are you? Very simple, straightforward question. Who are you? That's not even answered at the end of Book 8. Okay, he wait and wait and wait even to give his name to the Phaeacians. Because again, he is wanting to make sure that's a safe thing to do. Of course, you'll see that he gives his name prematurely to Polyphemus the Cyclops and learns a lesson from that. But most famously, of course, and I've already alluded to this, is when he disguises himself in Ithaca and really bides his time, really waits until just the most pregnant moment to reveal who he is. And he has to control himself because, of course, he wants to reveal himself even sooner, but he knows that he has to wait until the time is just right. So we see Homer doing kind of the same thing, right? He is shielding Odysseus from our eyes until the moment is just right. But this is not all about trickery. This is not all about cunning or cleverness. There's another side to this too. Odysseus is a man of patience and self-control. Those are two really, I think, defining characteristics of Odysseus. He has to delay his gratification. He has to control his impulses and his urges. And of course, he is rewarded handsomely for that in the end when he does reestablish himself in Ithaca. So just as Odysseus has to kind of bide his time and be patient and show self-control, in the first 4 books of the Odyssey, we as readers have to be patient and disciplined and bide our time before we actually can meet Odysseus himself. Again, there are other reasons why Homer might have used that technique. I mentioned one, the fact that it kind of ratchets up suspense. I think it's also worth mentioning that the delay of revealing Odysseus also gives us a very strong signal that Telemachus is a very important figure in this story too. It's not just about Odysseus. Telemachus is also a hero of the book, if not the hero. So Homer has other strategic reasons to use this delaying device as well, but I think it also is used because of how well it suits Odysseus and his character. Again, I could give other examples, but I hope that I have maybe opened your eyes a bit to why Homer is making the kinds of choices that he's making. And that's what you need to do when you read literature, or watch a movie, or something like that for that matter. Why is the narrator telling the story in the way that he or she is? And how does the mode of the story, how does the form of the story match, or maybe not match, the content? All right, well, I'll be back with you soon with the 3rd installment.